Chapter 17. We'll have to assume he saw us, Halt said, as they rode on. They had been riding in single file, but now Horace and Will pushed their horses up beside Halt so they could confer more easily. But did he recognize us? Will said. After all, we're a long way away, and we could be just 3 riders. Halt turned slightly in the saddle to look at his former pupil. What Will said was correct. Yet Halt hadn't lived as long as he had by taking chances and assuming that his enemies might make mistakes. If he saw us, we also have to assume that he recognized us. After all, Horace chipped in, when you two aren't skulking in the bushes, you're pretty recognizable. There aren't a lot of people riding around the countryside carrying great big longbows and wearing cowled cloaks. Thank you for pointing that out, Halt said dryly. But in fact, you're right, and the Genovesans are no fools. Now Tennyson will know we're behind him. He paused, scratching his beard thoughtfully as he pondered the situation. The question is, he said, more to himself than to the others, what to do next? Should we drop back a little? Will suggested. If we drop out of sight, Tennyson might assume that the Genovesan was mistaken, and we just happened to be 3 riders with no interest in him. No, I don't think so. That's hoping for too much. And if we drop back, we give them more time to give us the slip. I think we should do the opposite, push up on him. He'll know we're here, Horace said. Halt nodded at him. He knows we're here anyway, so let's push him. Let's make him feel crowded. That way he'll have to keep moving, and a moving target is easier to see than a concealed one. He came to a decision and added, in a positive tone, We'll put pressure on him. People under pressure make mistakes, and that could work for us. Of course, Horace began, then hesitated. Halt gestured for him to go ahead. Well, I was thinking, we'll be under pressure too, won't we? What if we make the mistake? Halt regarded him for several seconds without speaking. Then he turned to Will. He's a regular ray of sunshine, isn't he? They continued in silence for a few minutes. They were working their way up a long uphill slope to the point where they had seen the Genovesan on the skyline. They still had about 100 meters to go to reach the crest when Halt held up his hand to signal the others to stop. On the other hand, he said, in a quiet voice, Horace has a good point. The Genovesans are assassins, and one of their favorite techniques is ambush. It occurs to me that it might not be a good idea to go romping over that next crest, assuming that there's nothing to be concerned about. You think he's waiting for us? Will said, his eyes scanning the crest. I think he could be. So from now on, we don't go over any crests without scouting the land ahead of us. He made a move to swing down from the saddle, but Will forestalled him, dropping lightly to the trail. I'll do it, he said. Halt made as if to argue, then closed his mouth. His natural preference was always to keep Will out of harm's way, but he realized that he had to let the young man take his share of the danger. Don't take any chances, he said. Tug echoed the thought with a low rumble from his barrel of a chest. Will grinned at them both. Don't be such a pair of old grannies, he said. Then he slipped off into the shoulder-high gorse that lined the track. Bent double, he suddenly disappeared from sight. Horace made a slight sound of surprise. Halt looked at him. What is it? Horace gestured at the rolling clumps of coarse bush that covered the hillside. There was no sign of Will, no sign of anything moving in the bushes other than the wind. It doesn't matter how often I see him do that. It still spooks me every time. It's uncanny. Yes, said Halt, his eyes scanning the hillside above them. I suppose it would. He's very good at it. Of course, he added modestly, I taught him all he knows. I'm regarded as the expert on unseen movement in the Ranger Corps." Horace frowned. "I thought Gillen was the real expert," he said. "Will once told me he learned all the finer points from Gillen." "Oh, really?" Halt said, with a hint of frost in his voice. "And just who do you think taught Gillen?" That hadn't occurred to Horace. Not for the first time, he found himself wishing that his tongue wouldn't run so many meters in advance of his brain. "Oh, yes, you did, I suppose," he said, and Halt bowed slightly in the saddle. "Exactly," Halt said, with great dignity. "So, can you see where he is at the moment?" Horace asked curiously. He wondered if it worked that way. If you taught someone how to move without being seen, and you knew all their tricks, could you see them? Or were they invisible even to the person who taught them? "Naturally," Halt replied. "He's up there." Horace followed the direction of his pointing finger and saw Will standing erect at the crest of the hill. A few seconds later, they heard his signal whistle, and he waved for them to come forward. "Well, now you can see him," said Horace. "I can see him now. But could you see him before he stood up?" "Of course I could, Horace. How could you doubt me?" Halt said. Then he urged Abelard forward, gesturing for Tug to follow. His face was hidden from Horace as he went ahead, so the young warrior never saw the smile that creased it. "He seems to have kept on moving," Will said as they drew level with him, "although he could be anywhere out there." Below them, the land gradually sloped away, covered by the same thick gorse and bracken. Will was right. A crossbowman could be concealed anywhere in that tangle. Halt scanned the area thoughtfully. "Damn it," he said. "This is going to slow us down." "Which is the whole idea," Will said. "Precisely." Halt let go a sigh of exasperation. "I suppose this puts an end to the idea of putting pressure on him," Horace said. Halt regarded him coldly for a few seconds. The ranger's good humour seemed to desert him when his plans were thwarted, Horace thought. He also thought it might be a good idea to say nothing further for a while. Halt, satisfied that his unspoken message had registered, turned back to Will as he came to a decision. "Very well. You scout ahead, Will. I'll give you 50 meters, then we'll come up to you. You know the drill. Look, shout, shoot." Will nodded. He signaled for Tug to stay where he was, and half ran down the trail, his eyes on the ground, scanning the tracks left there. Halt edged Abelard around so he was on an angle on the trail, leaving Halt room to shoot, and nocked an arrow to his bowstring. His eyes scanned the ground either side of the track as Will proceeded. "All right if I ask you something, Halt," Horace said tentatively. He wasn't sure if he should intrude on the ranger's concentration with a question. But Halt simply nodded, without taking his attention off the rolling bushes. "Look, shout, shoot. What's that?" Horace asked. Halt began to answer. If Horace was going to be working with them in the future, it would be just as well to explain their methods to him whenever he asked. "It's the way we—" Then, catching sight of a small movement in the bushes to Will's right, he stopped talking and raised himself slightly in the stirrups, his bow coming up to the aiming position, the arrow beginning to slide back to full draw. A small bird fluttered out of the bush that he had been watching, flew a few meters, then settled fussily on another branch, burying its beak inside the petals of a flower. Halt relaxed, letting the arrow down again. Horace noticed that Will had caught sight of the movement too. He'd dropped to a crouch. Now, warily, he rose again and glanced back up to where Halt and Horace were watching. Halt waved him ahead. He nodded and began to move again, searching the ground as he did so. "Sorry, Horace," Halt said. "You wanted to know about look, shout, shoot. It's the way we approach a situation like this. Will is looking for their tracks and for any sign that someone might have left the trail and moved out to the side to wait in ambush. While he's doing that, his attention is distracted. So I keep watch either side of the track, just in case someone has left the path further along, then doubled back behind him. If I see a crossbowman rise up out of the bushes, I shout and Will drops to the ground instantly. At the same time, I shoot the crossbowman. Look, shout, shoot. He looks, you shout and shoot, Horace said. Exactly. And we do it in 50-meter increments, because if there is an ambush, my arrow will hit the ambusher all the more quickly. The problem's going to be when we reach those trees ahead of us. Horace looked up. The undulating gorse-covered terrain continued for another 2 or 3 kilometers. But then he could see the dark line of a thick forest. I guess you can't see for 50 meters in there, he said. Halt nodded. That's right. We'll have to do it in 20-meter rushes once we get in there. Come on, he added. Will's calling us forward. They rode down the slope to where Will was waiting for them. He grinned up at Halt as the 2 riders reined in. Tug nuzzled him and made grumbling noises. He was never happy when Will went on without him. Worry-wart, Will told him, patting his soft nose. But Halt looked approvingly at the little horse. Take him with you this time, he said. Should have thought of it before. He'll sense someone in the bushes quicker than we will. Will looked a little concerned at the idea. I don't want to risk Tug getting hit by one of those crossbow bolts. Halt smiled at him. Now who's the worry-wart? Will shrugged. All the same, he said, I'd be more comfortable if he were back with you if someone starts shooting. And I'll be more comfortable if he were with you, Halt told him. Then he patted the longbow where it lay across his knees. Don't worry, the only one who's going to start any shooting is me.